Giant Apache found a woman begging for food. What he left her with changed her life. On a frozen frontier street, a starving widow falls to her knees, begging strangers for scraps. Boots pass her by, eyes turn away, and the church bell tolls, as if marking her final hour. But then through the dust comes a towering Apache rider. He does not offer her bread. He leaves something stranger, a small pouch and a warning to guard it with her life. Inside lies more than food, a secret tied to the land itself, a promise powerful enough to feed the hungry or stir a war with the railroad. Whispers of fire, betrayal, and broken treaties spread like smoke as the widow stands between despair and redemption. But one question grips the town, the railroad, and her own trembling heart. What did the giant Apache truly give her, and will it save her life or destroy it? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. Through the biting Colorado wind, Eliza May Cartwright huddled against the rough wooden wall of Thompson's General Store. Her thin shawl offered little protection from the late winter chill of 1878. Each gust cut through the worn fabric like knives of ice, making her shoulders tremble despite her efforts to stay still. The afternoon crowd hurried past, their boots crunching on the frozen mud of the street. Eliza kept her eyes downcast, her cracked hands clasped together as she whispered her plea. Please. Any help you could spare. A miner in a heavy coat quickened his pace as he passed. Ain't got nothin' for the likes of you, he muttered, pulling his collar higher. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door made her stomach clench painfully. How long had it been since her last proper meal? 3 days? 4? The days had begun to blur together like watercolors in the rain. A ranch wife clutching packages to her chest to the other side of the street, steering her children away, with hushed warnings about that shiftless Cartwright woman. The words stung, but Eliza lifted her chin slightly. They didn't know about the mining accident that had taken James, or how the company had denied his widow's pension. The sun was sinking toward the purple mountains when heavy boots stopped before her. A drunken teamster swayed on his feet, grinning down at her with yellow teeth. Here's your dinner, woman. He tossed a chunk of stale bread that landed in the mud. His laughter echoed as he staggered away. Eliza stared at the soiled crust, her throat tight. She wouldn't. She couldn't. Not yet. Sheriff Miller passed by, his star glinting in the fading light. His eyes met hers briefly, showing something like pity, but he continued on his rounds without a word. Eliza understood. The law couldn't help with empty cupboards and unpaid rent. As twilight painted the sky in deep blues and grays, the clip-clop of hooves drew her attention. A massive figure on horseback emerged from the gathering shadows. The rider sat tall in his saddle, wrapped in a thick blanket against the cold. Even in the dim light there was no mistaking him. Taza, the Apache who sometimes traded in town. She had seen him before, always keeping to himself, speaking little but carrying himself with quiet authority. Some townsfolk crossed the street when they saw him coming. Others whispered about his past as an army scout, though none seemed to know the true story. Taza dismounted with fluid grace despite his size, tying his horse to the hitching post. His moccasins made no sound as he climbed the store's wooden steps. Through the window, Eliza watched him make his purchases: flour, salt, nothing more. His movements were efficient, purposeful. When he emerged, she expected him to ride away like all the others. Instead, he paused, dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But something in his gaze held her still. He knelt before her, movement smooth as flowing water. From beneath his blanket, he withdrew a leather pouch, wrapped carefully with sinew ties. His large hands, scarred but gentle, placed it in her trembling ones. Guard this, he said, voice low and rich as summer thunder. The words weren't a command, but they carried weight, importance. Before she could find her voice to question or thank him, he had risen, mounted his horse, and vanished into the gathering dusk like a spirit. The hoofbeats faded, leaving only the wind's moan in her racing heart. Eliza stared at the pouch in her hands. It was light, but not empty. The leather was soft with age, decorated with faded designs she couldn't quite make out in the failing light. Her fingers traced the careful ties, but she didn't dare untie them. Not here, not now. rising on stiff legs, she made her way to the livery stable, climbing the narrow back stairs to her rented room. The wood creaked beneath her feet, protesting each step. The familiar musty smell of hay and horses drifted up from below. Her room was little more than a closet with a narrow bed and a three-legged table, but it was shelter. A stub of candle provided weak light as she sank onto the thin mattress, still clutching the mysterious pouch. The wind whistled through cracks in the walls, making the flame dance. Eliza placed the pouch carefully on her lap, studying it in the flickering light. What could be so important that a man like Taza would entrust it to her? Why her, of all people? She was nothing in this town, less than nothing, if the whispers were to be believed. But he had chosen her, had looked at her with eyes that saw more than just a beggar woman, had given her not charity, but responsibility. Trust. She wrapped the pouch in her shawl and tucked it beneath her flat pillow. Whatever it contained would have to wait until morning. For now, she had been given a purpose, however small or temporary. As she blew out the candle and curled beneath her thin blanket, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in many months. Hoped that the cold wind continued its assault on the building, but somehow its bite seemed less fierce. In the darkness, Eliza's hand crept beneath her pillow to touch the wrapped pouch, reassuring herself it wasn't a dream. Sleep came slowly, but it came with the weight of trust against her palm and the memory of dark eyes that had seen her. Truly seen her, for the first time in too long. Eliza tossed and turned on her thin mattress, the mysterious pouch beneath her pillow seeming to whisper secrets into the darkness. The livery stable below creaked and settled, horses shuffling in their stalls. Finally, when the moon hung high outside her window, she could wait no longer. Sitting up, she lit the stub of candle with trembling hands. The flame cast dancing shadows on the rough walls as she carefully withdrew the leather pouch. In the wavering light, she could now see the intricate patterns worked into the aged leather, flowing lines that might have been rivers, mountains, or something else entirely. Her fingers fumbled with the sinew ties, working them loose with reverent care. The contents spilled onto her lap, a small deerskin bag and a folded paper sealed with red wax. The bag felt heavy with promise. Opening it, she found smooth, golden kernels of maize, seeds that gleamed like tiny nuggets in the lamplight. She held one between her fingers, marveling at its perfect shape. The sealed paper drew her attention next. The wax cracked as she carefully unfolded the document, its official lettering stark against the yellowed page. Her heart began to pound as she read. The text alternated between precise English and unfamiliar symbols she recognized as Apache script. But what made her breath catch were the official United States government signatures and seals at the bottom. Lord. Above, she whispered, scanning the English portions again and again. It appeared to be a land deed, a legal allotment granting rights to a valley several miles from town. She knew the place. She had passed it on the stage when she and James had first arrived. A beautiful valley with a clear stream running through it, sheltered by red rock walls. Sleep was impossible now. She paced her tiny room until the first gray light of dawn appeared. As soon as it was decent, she wrapped herself in her shawl and hurried through the quiet streets to the small clapboard church where Reverend Caraway lived. The Reverend answered her knock still in his dressing gown, gray hair tousled. "Mrs. Cartwright, is everything all right? I'm sorry to wake you so early, Reverend, but I need your counsel." She thrust the paper toward him. "Please, can you tell me if this is real?" Reverend Caraway squinted at the document, holding it close to his face in the dim morning light. He gestured her inside and lit a lamp on his desk. For long minutes, he studied the paper while Eliza perched anxiously on a wooden chair. "Well," he said finally, looking up at her over his wire-rimmed spectacles, "this appears to be a legitimate treaty allotment. All the proper seals and signatures are present." He paused, studying her face. "How did you come by this?" Eliza explained about Taza and the pouch. The Reverend nodded slowly, his gentle eyes thoughtful. "I believe this might be Providence at work, Mrs. Cartwright." His voice was soft but carried conviction. "The Lord often moves in unexpected ways. That valley is good land, fertile soil, reliable water. With hard work, it could support a family." Hope blazed in Eliza's chest. "Then you think I should claim it?" "I think you must follow your conscience," he said carefully. "But yes, I believe this opportunity has been placed in your path for a reason." "A reason?" Buoyed by his words, Eliza hurried to town as businesses began to open. Surely others would share her joy at this chance for a fresh start. She showed the deed first to Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile, then to Mr. Thompson at the General Store. Instead of congratulations, she was met with skepticism and derision. An Indian trick, nothing more, Mrs. Henderson scoffed, barely glancing at the document. You'd be a fool to trust it. Mr. Thompson's reaction was even worse. That valley? His face grew serious. The railroads had their eye on that land for months. They're planning to run a new line through there. He shook his head. Best forget about it, Mrs. Cartwright. Some fights ain't worth picking. Word spread quickly through the small town. As Eliza walked down the boardwalk, she heard the whispers. Did you hear? That Cartwright woman claims she owns Miller's Valley. Indians gave her some paper, probably worthless. Railroad won't stand for it. She found Sheriff Miller outside his office, warming himself in the morning sun. When she showed him the deed, his weathered face creased with concern. Ma'am, I don't doubt this paper might be legal in some technical sense, he said slowly. But that valley's been causing trouble lately. Railroad companies already started surveying. They've got money and lawyers aplenty. He touched the brim of his hat. Best let it be, Mrs. Cartwright, for your own good. Eliza walked back to her room above the livery, clutching the deed and seed pouch to her chest. The morning's bright promise had dimmed, but something stronger than mere optimism had taken root in her heart. She thought of Taza's dignified bearing, of Reverend Carraway's quiet encouragement, of the golden seeds waiting to be planted. Sitting on her narrow bed, she smoothed the deed with careful fingers. The land was legally hers. The seeds were a gift, a chance to grow something new from barren earth. After months of depending on others' charity, she had been given tools to build her own future. Let them whisper. Let them doubt. She had spent too long watching life pass her by from the sidelines. This valley, these seeds, they were more than just property. They were hope itself, wrapped in leather and sealed with wax. Eliza tucked the precious items back into their pouch and held them close. She would not surrender this chance. Not to fear, not to ridicule, and certainly not to a railroad company that would cut through that peaceful valley without a second thought. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. But for now, she had purpose again. She had a future to fight for. And for the first time since James's death, she felt truly alive. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Eliza counted out her last silver dollar with trembling fingers and placed it in the weathered palm of old Mr. Jenkins at the livery stable. In return, she received the lead rope of an elderly brown mule, thin but sturdy, with patient eyes, and a graying muzzle. She ain't much to look at, Mr. Jenkins admitted, patting the mule's neck, but she's sure-footed and gentle. Name's Betty. Eliza nodded, gathering her few possessions into a bundle. The precious leather pouch containing the deed and seeds was tucked securely in her skirt pocket, its weight reassuring against her hip. With careful movements, she tied her bundle to Betty's back and took the lead rope in hand. The trail leading out of town wound northwest, rutted from winter wagons and spring thaw. Melting snow had turned much of the path to thick mud that pulled at her boots and made Betty's hooves squelch with every step. Eliza led the mule carefully, watching for loose stones or dangerous spots where the mud might cause a slip. The morning wore into afternoon as they climbed steadily higher into the foothills. Though the sun shone bright, the wind carried winters. Last bite. Eliza's thin coat offered little protection, and her fingers grew stiff around the lead rope. Still, she pressed on, one step at a time. It was late afternoon when she finally crested a ridge and stopped, catching her breath. Below her stretched the valley she had only glimpsed from the stagecoach months ago. Now she could see it properly, a narrow stretch of land embraced by red rock walls, with a clear creek threading through its heart like a silver ribbon. Ancient cottonwoods lined the waterway, their bare branches reaching toward the sky. And there, in the center, she could make out the remnants of old furrows in the soil, evidence this land had once been worked. Oh, she breathed, her chest tight with emotion. After months of desperate survival, of living on scraps and charity, here was something that could be hers. Something she could build upon. Eliza led Betty down the slope to a relatively flat area near the creek. Her muscles ached from the long walk as she untied her bundle and gathered dry wood for a fire. The sun was sinking toward the western ridgeline, painting the rock walls in deep orange and purple shadows. She managed to get a small fire going and sat beside it, savoring a hard crust of bread, her only meal of the day. As darkness gathered, she found herself imagining what the valley might look like in summer. Where would she plant the corn? How many furrows could she manage alone? The question swirled in her mind as she watched sparks rise from her little fire into the darkening sky. A shadow moved at the edge of her firelight. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing a burning stick from the fire and holding it out like a weapon. Betty snorted softly but didn't seem alarmed. The shadow resolved into Taza's tall form. He stepped into the circle of firelight, his blanket wrapped around broad shoulders, his face impassive. Eliza's hand trembled, but she kept the burning branch raised. "You came," he said simply, his English careful and measured. He made no move toward her, standing still as stone. "The deed," Eliza managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was yours to give?" Taza nodded slowly. He gestured to the valley. Around them, his movement graceful despite his size. "My people farmed here, many seasons, good soil, good water." His face hardened slightly. "Then soldiers came. Moved us to reservation land, far south." He knelt and picked up a handful of dark earth, letting it sift through his fingers. "Railroad men come soon. They break land, build iron road." His dark eyes met hers. "I watched you. Outside store. Near death, like valley will be when railroad. Comies." He pointed to the soil. "You looked hungry. For food, yes, but more hungry for purpose. Maybe you honor soil better than iron horse." Eliza slowly lowered the burning branch, though weariness still tensed her shoulders. "Why help me? Sit," he said, gesturing to the fire. "I show you something." After a moment's hesitation, she sank back down to her place by the flames. Taza settled across from her, movements deliberate and non-threatening. He reached for another handful of soil and held it out. "Look close," he instructed. "Squeeze soil. If it holds shape but breaks easy, good for growing. If it stays hard ball, too much clay. If it falls apart, too much sand." Eliza tentatively took a handful of earth and squeezed it as he demonstrated. The soil formed a loose ball that crumbled gently when she poked it. Taza nodded approvingly. "Good soil," he said. "Dark color means rich. See how water soaks in?" He poured a few drops from his water skin onto the ground. Not too fast, not too slow. Good drainage. Despite her lingering uncertainty, Eliza found herself leaning forward, watching intently as he explained more signs of fertile soil. He spoke of watching which wild plants grew naturally, of testing soil depth with a stick, of finding the places where morning sun would warm spring seedlings. The night deepened around the eastern sky had barely begun to pale when Eliza stirred from her makeshift bed of blankets. Her muscles ached from yesterday's journey, but determination pushed her to her feet. The valley lay quiet in the pre-dawn light, frost glittering on the grass. She pulled the leather pouch from her pocket and carefully counted out the golden maize seeds in her palm. They felt smooth and cool, precious as gold itself. Looking at the expanse of untilled earth before her, she took a deep breath and knelt in the soil. The ground was still partially frozen, unyielding beneath her fingers as she tried to dig the first furrow. She scraped and clawed at the earth, but made little progress. Within an hour, blisters had formed on her palms, and her fingernails were torn and dirty. Sweat dampened her collar despite the morning chill. "Not like that," came a quiet voice behind her. Eliza startled, turning to find Taza standing there, holding a crude wooden hoe in his large hands. She hadn't heard him approach. The Apache man stepped forward and held out the tool. "Here," he said simply. "Watch." Taking the hoe, he demonstrated the proper motion, a steady, rhythmic movement that broke the soil in clean lines. His movements were efficient, born of long experience. After creating several rows, he handed the tool to her. "Try," he instructed. Eliza gripped the wooden handle, copying his motions. Her first attempts were awkward, but Taza nodded approvingly when she found the right rhythm. They worked side by side as the sun climbed higher, saying little. His calm presence steadied her, making the task feel less overwhelming. By midday, they had prepared enough ground for the first planting. Taza showed her how to measure the proper depth for each seed using the width of 2 fingers. Together, they placed the golden kernels in the earth, covering them carefully with soil. As they worked, Eliza gathered her courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Why are you helping me?" Taza paused, looking out across the valley they had begun to transform. "The land must live," he said finally, his voice deep and certain. "If you live, it lives." The simple words carried a weight of truth that settled in Eliza's heart. She nodded, understanding more than just the words themselves. When the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, Taza gathered his things to leave. Eliza watched him go, feeling somehow less alone than before. She built up her fire and set a small pot of beans to cook, trying to ignore the growing ache in her shoulders and back. Night settled over the valley like a heavy blanket. The beans were bland but filling, and Eliza sat close to the glowing embers of her fire, drawing what warmth she could from them. In the darkness beyond her camp, coyotes began their nightly chorus, high, wavering howls that made her skin prickle with unease. Yet beneath her fear, a seedling of hope had taken root. As surely as the maize seeds now rested in the soil. Morning came again, bringing with it new challenges. Eliza rose stiffly, her muscles protesting every movement. But the sight of yesterday's furrows gave her courage. She led Betty to the uncleared ground, rigging the mule with rope to help break new soil. The work was harder than she expected. The mule sometimes balked, and Eliza collected new bruises as she stumbled over rough ground. Still, she persisted, stopping only when the sun grew too hot. Days began to pass in a steady rhythm. Each morning she rose with the sun to tend her growing rows. The hours were filled with endless small tasks, hauling water from the creek, mending tiers in her tent, gathering firewood, and always more digging. Her hands grew calloused, and her skin darkened under the spring sun. Through it all, the valley's beauty slowly revealed itself to her. She noticed things she hadn't seen at first, the way morning light painted the red rock walls gold, how the cottonwoods whispered in the wind, the tracks of deer coming to drink at dawn. Even in its wildness, or perhaps because of it, the land felt increasingly like home. The first week passed slowly, marked by sore muscles and quiet prayers. Each evening, Eliza would touch the soil where her seeds lay buried, whispering words of encouragement to them and to herself. The work was hard, harder than anything she'd done before, but it was hers. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the stirring of pride in her labor. In the rows she dug with her own hands. At the end of that first week, she stood at sunset, looking over what she had accomplished. The newly turned earth formed neat dark lines against the valley floor. Though no sprouts yet showed, she knew life stirred beneath the surface. Her muscles ached, her clothes were dirt-stained, and her face was wind-burned, but Eliza felt something she hadn't in months: dignity. A quote from her father's worn Bible came to mind. "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy." She wasn't sure about joy yet, but she had found purpose in this valley, and for now, that was enough. A week after planting her first seeds, Eliza led Betty the mule down the muddy trail back to town. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, were now rough and raw from working the soil. Red cracks crossed her palms like tiny rivers, and her fingers felt stiff and swollen. Still, she walked with her head higher than before, the purpose of her errand lending strength to her steps. The general store's bell jingled as she entered. Inside, the familiar smell of leather, coffee, and tobacco wrapped around her. Several townspeople turned to stare, their conversations dropping to whispers. Eliza kept her eyes forward, moving purposefully toward the seed bins. "Well, if it ain't the squatter," drawled a ranch wife near the counter. "Come to buy more Indian tricks?" Eliza's cheeks burned, but she didn't respond. Instead, she began selecting seed potatoes, checking each one carefully as Taza had taught her. She'd learned more about farming in a week than in all her previous years. "Ain't right," muttered another customer. "Taking up Indian ground like that, bound to bring trouble." The shopkeeper, Mr. Peterson, approached with unusual hesitation. "Miss Cartwright, Before he could finish, the store's door swung open. With a bang, a man in an expensive Eastern suit stepped in, his boots gleaming despite the mud outside. His dark hair was slicked back with oil, and a gold watch chain crossed his vest. Eliza recognized him as Mr. Nathaniel Kettle, the railroad's lawyer. "Ah, the very person I hoped to find," Kettle said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He pulled a leather folio from under his arm. "Miss Cartwright, I believe we need to discuss your situation." "I have nothing to discuss with you, sir," Eliza replied, turning back to her shopping. Kettle stepped closer, unfolding several papers with flourishing gestures. "I'm afraid you do. You see, that valley you've taken to squatting in? It's under official railroad survey for a planned spur line. Been marked for development since last fall." The other customers gathered closer, eager for the drama unfolding. Eliza's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet Kettle's gaze. "I have a legal deed to that land." Kettle laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "That worthless piece of paper? Some ancient Indian grant?" He waved his own documents. "These are proper Railway Commission surveys. Progress is coming, Miss Cartwright. Best step aside gracefully." "Now?" "Hold on there, Mr. Kettle." The voice came from the doorway where Reverend Caraway stood, his worn Bible tucked under one arm. The preacher stepped forward, his usually gentle face set in firm lines. "That document you're dismissing bears valid signatures from both territorial and federal authorities," the Reverend continued. "I've examined it myself. It's a legal allotment understanding treaties." Kettle's smile turned cold. "Treaties change, Reverend. Courts rule. And railroad rights-of-way take precedence over questionable land grants." He turned back to Eliza. "You'll be hearing from our attorneys, Miss Cartwright. Don't get too comfortable in that valley." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Eliza's hands trembled as she quickly gathered her purchases, seed potatoes, a hoe, and some other basic tools. She paid without meeting anyone's eyes, feeling the weight of their stares. The walk back to her valley seemed longer than before, each step heavy with worry. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. As she finally crested the familiar ridge, she'd only been gone half a day, but the sight of her small camp and the newly turned earth brought unexpected comfort. As dusk approached, Taza appeared as he often did, moving like a shadow through the cottonwoods. Eliza sat by her fire, the day's events spilling out of her in a rush of words. The Apache man listened in silence, his face grave in the firelight. When she finished, Taza was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his words measured and deep. "Railroad takes all it touches, like a great snake eating the earth." He looked at her steadily. "But truth is stronger if you endure." "How can I fight them?" Eliza whispered. "They have lawyers' money, power. You are not alone," Taza replied. "I will speak to the elders. Some remember when this deed was made. Their words have power, too." He rose to leave, pausing to add, "The land chose you, woman. Remember that." After he disappeared into the growing darkness, Eliza walked to the Tia Creek. The water whispered over stones, constant and soothing. She knelt on the bank, pulling the deed from her pocket. The paper felt fragile in her rough hands, yet it represented everything she'd begun to hope for. A home, a purpose, a future. "Lord," she prayed softly, "I ain't asking for much. Just strength to stand against what's coming. This valley. It's starting to feel like home." A sudden breeze stirred the cottonwoods, sending shadows dancing across the ground. From the direction of her camp, Betty let out a loud, nervous bray. The mule's cry echoed off the valley walls, setting Eliza's nerves on edge. She clutched the deed tighter, feeling as if unseen eyes watched from the darkness. Rising slowly, she made her way back to her fire, every shadow seeming to hold potential threats. Betty stamped and snorted, clearly unsettled by something in the night. Eliza added wood to her fire, building it higher than usual. The flames pushed back the darkness, but couldn't quite reach the fear that had taken root in her heart. The spring sun warmed Eliza's back as she worked the soil, her movements growing more confident with each passing day. The creek's gentle murmur kept time as she channeled its water through careful furrows, just as Taza had shown her. Her hands, though still tender, moved with growing purpose through the dark earth. A shadow fell across her work, and she looked up to find Taza standing there, holding a clay pot and a folded blanket. The pot's sides were decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of ancient craft. For you, he said simply, setting both items down. Beans for planting. Blanket for cold nights. Eliza's throat tightened at the unexpected kindness. I'm much obliged, she managed, running her fingers over the blanket's tightly woven wool. Taza nodded, then moved to the creek's edge. Come, I show you water's path. For the next hour, he taught her how to guide the creek water into shallow channels that would feed her growing crops. His knowledge seemed as natural as breathing, passed down through generations who had lived with this land. The water remembers, he explained, showing her how to direct the flow with small stones and packed earth. It wants to go where it went before. You just help it find the way. Eliza watched in wonder as the water followed the paths they created, spreading life through her planted rows. It's like magic, she whispered. Not magic, memory. Taza's eyes crinkled slightly. Land remembers. Water remembers. People forget. The afternoon light was growing long when a small figure appeared on the trail leading down to their valley. Eliza straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. A boy, thin and ragged, picked his way carefully down the slope. She recognized him from town, Tommy Reed, an orphan who did odd jobs for meals. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, his face dirty but his eyes bright with determination. Ma'am, he called out, twisting his cap in his hands. I heard tell in town you might need help. I can carry water, whatever you need. Just ... Maybe for a bite to eat? Eliza's heart squeezed in her chest. How many times had she nearly begged? The same way, before Taza gave her this chance? She brushed her hands on her skirt and smiled. Come here, child. When's the last time you ate? Tommy shuffled closer, eyes darting between her and Taza. Yesterday morning, ma'am. Had some biscuit. From the cook at Miller's. Eliza went to her camp and returned with a thick slice of cornbread, her last piece from yesterday's baking. Here, eat this first, then we'll talk about work. The boy's face lit up as he took the bread, though he tried to eat slowly, with dignity. While he ate, Eliza explained what needed doing, carrying water, clearing stones from the planting rows, helping to channel the creek. Tommy threw himself into the work with surprising energy. His small hands were quick and clever, and soon the sound of his laughter mixed with the creek song. Even Taza seemed to approve, showing the boy how to test if stones would make good channel markers. As the sun began to set, Eliza walked her rows one last time. She stopped suddenly, kneeling to look closer at the ground. There, pushing through the dark soil, were tiny green shoots, the first of her maize sprouting toward the sky. Tommy, come see, she called, her voice trembling. With joy, the boy ran over, dropping to his knees beside her. Together they marveled at the delicate sprouts, so small yet so full of promise. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. These tiny plants were hope made visible, proof that life could begin again. Can I stay tonight? Tommy asked hesitantly. As darkness crept into the valley. I could help more tomorrow. Eliza looked at his thin face, remembering her own lost family. The husband taken by mining accident, the baby that never drew breath. Of course you can, child. Here, she handed him Taza's blanket. Sleep by the fire. It'll keep the chill off. That night, Eliza lay awake in her small tent, listening to Tommy's steady breathing from where he slept, wrapped in the blanket by the fire's dying embers. The ache of old losses mingled with something new, not quite hope, not quite healing. But perhaps the beginning of both. Morning came with dew silvering the valley. After a breakfast of coffee and the last of her flour biscuits, Eliza knew she had to take Tommy back to town. She needed supplies anyway, and the boy had his own odd jobs to tend to. You can come back, she promised as they walked the trail. Together, Tommy's small hand sometimes seeking hers when the path grew steep. Anytime you want to help, there's food and welcome here. Yes, ma'am, he said, smile bright despite his returning to town's uncertainties. I'd like that. Eliza watched him trot off toward the livery stable where he sometimes slept. Something had changed in the valley yesterday, not just the sprouts breaking through soil, but something in her heart as well, a tiny green shoot. Of family, perhaps. Pushing up through the dark earth of her loneliness, she touched the rough wall of the general store, gathering herself for the stares and whispers that would come. But today they seemed to matter less. She had growing things. In her valley now, and a boy's laughter echoing off its walls, and the memory of green leaves reaching for the sun. It was enough. It was a beginning. The July sun beat down on Eliza's valley, turning the morning dew to steam that rose from her flourishing maize plants. She walked between the rows, trailing her fingers along leaves that now reached above her knees. The strong green stalks swayed in the warm breeze, whispering promises of harvest. Tommy hauled water from the creek, his small shoulders squared with pride in his work. The boy had grown stronger over the past months, his face filling out from regular meals at Eliza's fire. He hummed as he worked, an old hymn from Sunday service. "Looking fine," came Taza's quiet voice from the edge of the field. He appeared like this sometimes, silent as a shadow until he chose to speak. Today he carried a bundle of dried meat and some fresh-caught fish. "The plants remember your teaching," Eliza said, smiling. She'd grown comfortable with his presence, learning to read meaning in his subtle expressions and brief words. They settled. By the morning fire, where coffee bubbled in Eliza's dented pot, these quiet moments had become a rhythm in their days. Sharing food, watching the valley wake, speaking little but understanding much. Later that morning, Eliza hitched her mule to the wagon for her weekly trip to town. Tommy rode beside her, legs swinging from the wooden seat. As they approached the dusty main street, the boys' cheerful chatter faded. They both felt the weight of townsfolk stares. Outside the general store, a rancher, Bill Hawkins by name, turned and spat deliberately near Eliza's feet as she passed. "Indian lover," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Eliza lifted her chin and walked past, though her hands trembled as she gathered her supplies. The shopkeeper's wife watched her with narrow eyes, counting out change with sharp movements. Sunday service brought fresh pain. Mrs. Peterson, who'd always been friendly before, drew back when Eliza offered her hand during the greeting. Other women shifted away in their pews, leaving a circle of empty space around her. But Reverend Caraway's steady gaze met hers as he took the pulpit. His sermon that day spoke of faith growing in barren soil, of hope blooming where least expected. "The Lord's bounty," he preached, "often comes through unexpected vessels, teaching us to see his face in those we once called stranger." After the service, he pressed her hand warmly. "Your valley flourishes, Mrs. Cartwright. Don't let their fear shake your resolve." "Thank you, Reverend," she whispered, drawing strength from his kindness. The last days of July brought unexpected visitors. Taza rode in one evening leading 2 horses. Behind him sat 2 Apache women, their dark eyes watching Eliza carefully as they dismounted. "My sister's wife and her mother," Taza explained simply. "They wish to see you're growing." The women, Mary Hawk and Sarah Hawk in English, though Taza called them different names in Apache, carried baskets woven with intricate patterns. They walked Eliza's rows slowly, touching leaves, testing soil between their fingers. Though they spoke little English, they nodded approval at her work. From their baskets came gifts, dried herbs for medicine and cooking, a finely woven basket for gathering, smooth stones for grinding corn. Mary Hawk took Eliza's rough hands in her own, turning them palm up. She pulled out a small clay pot of salve, showing Eliza how to work it into her calluses and splits. The simple touch of care brought tears to Eliza's eyes. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the valley, Eliza stirred a pot of rabbit stew seasoned with her gifted herbs. Tommy sat cross-legged by the fire, carefully weaving a small basket under Sarah Hawk's patient guidance. Though they shared no common words, the boy's quick fingers and eager attention needed no translation. Taza watched them all, his usual silence softened by something like contentment. When Mary Hawk began to hum a low melodic song, he explained quietly to Eliza, a blessing for growing things. For new family. The stars emerged one by one as they shared the stew, passing Eliza's tin cups between them. Tommy fell asleep with his head on her knee, the unfinished basket still clutched in his hands. Sarah Hawk draped a blanket over him with grandmother's gentleness. Looking around the fire at these faces, Apache women who had chosen to share their wisdom, a boy who had become like a son, a man who had given her a future with an act of trust, Eliza felt the strange wonder of her position. She stood between 2 worlds, not fully belonging to either, yet somehow building bridges between them. Mary Hawk pressed more herbs into her hands as they prepared to leave, gesturing that they would return. Their horses disappeared into the darkness. But Taza remained, adding wood to the fire. They say you have good hands for growing, he told her. Good heart for learning. Will they come again? Eliza asked hopefully. Taza nodded. When moon is full, they will teach you more. He paused, looking at the sleeping boy. You make good home here. Despite hard words in town. Eliza gazed across her valley, silver now, in the starlight. Her maize stirred in the night breeze, strong and sure. Tommy's quiet breathing mixed with the creek's song. Here, in this place of in-between, she had found something she thought lost forever. Yes, she said softly. Despite everything, it's becoming home. August arrived with merciless heat that shimmered above Eliza's valley like a furnace. The creek ran lower each day, its voice reduced to a whisper over sun-warmed stones. In the fields, Eliza's maize stood tall and proud. Tassels waving in the hot wind like golden banners. Dawn to dusk found her moving between the rows, pulling stubborn weeds that thrived in the summer heat. Her hands, though calloused now, still ached from the constant work. Tommy helped when he could, his small fingers quick at plucking the unwanted growth. Like finding treasure, he would say, showing her particularly deep roots he'd managed to pull whole from the earth. Nights brought different battles. Raccoons crept from the cottonwoods, drawn by the ripening corn. Eliza took to sleeping outside, wrapped in her blanket, startling awake at every rustle to wave her lantern and shout into the darkness. One morning, as the sun barely touched the eastern hills, Eliza walked her usual path to check the fields. The soil felt different under her feet. She stopped, breath catching as she noticed deep hoof prints cutting through her carefully tended ground. Taza arrived shortly after, as if sensing trouble. He dismounted in silence, kneeling to study the tracks. His fingers traced the impressions, reading them like words on a page. 3 riders, he said finally, voice grave. Heavy horses. Railroad men, not ranch stock. He pointed to marks in the dirt. They circled your field. Watching. Planning. Eliza's hands trembled as she touched a broken cornstalk. What can I do? Be ready, Taza answered, eyes scanning the horizon. They don't fight fair. The warning proved true 3 days later. Eliza was weeding near the creek when Tommy's shout split the air. Fire, fire in the field. She looked up to see smoke rising from the far end of her corn. Flames licked between the rows, spreading fast in the dry August heat. Without thinking, she ran for the creek, snatching up buckets. Tommy, get water, she screamed, already running toward the flames. The boy moved like lightning, hauling water from the creek. Together they fought the fire, throwing bucketful after bucketful onto the burning corn. Smoke stung their eyes and throats. The flames seemed to laugh at their efforts, leaping higher, consuming her precious crop. Taza appeared through the haze, leading his horse. He'd stripped blankets from its back and began beating at the flames, moving with desperate precision. Other figures emerged, the Apache women who had befriended Eliza, bringing more blankets, more hands to fight, but the fire had too great a head start. For hours they battled, until the sun hung low and red through the smoke. When the last flames died, Eliza stood in her ruined field, surrounded by blackened stalks that had been green and vital that morning. Her legs gave way. She fell to her knees in the scorched earth, tears cutting trails through the soot on her face. All their work, all their hope reduced to ash in a single afternoon. Tommy huddled against her, his small body shaking with sobs. She pulled him close, feeling his tears soak her shoulder. The Apache women moved through the field, speaking softly to each other as they assessed the damage. Taza stood like a statue, staring at the destruction. When he finally turned to Eliza, his eyes burned with controlled fury. Railroad men, he said, voice hard as iron. They will not stop, not until they take all. What's left to take? Eliza whispered, gesturing at the devastation. Your spirit, your right to be here. He knelt beside her, pulling a handful of scorched earth through his fingers. There is one way, Fort Garland. The treaty is registered there. If commanders see the paper, see you working the land. He paused. It may force railroad to honor law. Eliza looked around at her ruined field. Most of her crop lay in ashes, but here and there, stalks remained standing, scorched but alive. Like her own spirit, battered but not yet broken. That night, She couldn't bear to sleep inside her small shelter. She sat by the creek, Tommy's head in her lap, watching stars appear above the smoke-stained valley. The boy had refused to leave, claiming his usual spot by her fire. "Tell me about your husband," Tommy said softly. His voice small in the darkness. Eliza stroked his hair, remembering James's face, his laugh, the way he'd loved this wild country. "He was a good man," she began. "Strong, but gentle too. He could lift a wagon wheel alone, but he'd stop to help baby birds that fell from their nests." She told Tommy about James's dreams of a farm, how he'd taken mining work to save money for land, how he'd kiss her goodbye each morning, promising that someday they'd have a place of their own. "The mine collapse took him before we found our place," she said, voice catching. "But he taught me about holding on to hope, about getting back up when life knocks you down." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "Like we're doing now?" "Yes, dear heart, just like now." She touched one of the surviving corn stalks, its leaves still green despite the fire's passing. "As long as something grows, we don't give up." Taza's words about Fort Garland echoed in her mind. The trip would be dangerous, the outcome uncertain. But as she sat in her smoke-damaged valley, holding a boy who had become like a son, she felt something steel itself inside her. They might burn her crops, but they couldn't burn her faith. They might scorch her land, but they couldn't destroy her claim to it. As long as one stalk stood, as long as one seed remained, she would fight for this place that had become home. 2 days after the fire, morning fog clung to the valley as Eliza, Taza, and Tommy prepared for their journey. The mule snorted and stamped as they hitched it to the borrowed wagon, its breath making clouds in the cool air. Eliza tucked the precious deed inside her shawl, close to her heart. "It's a long ride." "To Fort Garland," Taza said, adjusting the harness with practiced hands. 2 days there, 2 back, if the weather holds." Tommy bounced on his toes, excited despite the serious nature of their mission. "I ain't never been to a real fort before." "Haven't ever been," Eliza corrected gently, helping him climb onto the wagon seat. The boy's enthusiasm lightened her heart, though worry gnawed at her insides. They set out as the sun burned away the last wisps of fog. Taza rode beside them on his horse, scanning the horizon with watchful eyes. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned over the rocky terrain, following an old trail that wound through seas of gray-green sagebrush. By midday, the summer heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. Dust coated their clothes and filled their mouths. Tommy dozed against Eliza's shoulder while she kept the mule steady. The landscape rolled past in waves of scrubland and stone, broken only by the occasional twisted juniper. Taza pointed out water sources and safe camping spots, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. His quiet confidence gave Eliza strength, though she noticed how his jaw tightened whenever he mentioned the fort. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered draw. While Tommy gathered firewood, Eliza watched Taza tend to the animals. "Will they listen?" she asked softly. "At the fort?" "Some might," he replied, his voice careful. "But army paper men see world different from land people." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Must try anyway." They reached Fort Garland late the next afternoon. The adobe walls rose from the plains like a strange, squared mountain. Soldiers in dusty blue uniforms moved about the parade ground, while an American flag hung limp in the still air. Eliza's hands trembled as she straightened her worn dress. The deed felt heavy in her pocket. Tommy stayed close to her side as they approached the headquarters building, Taza following a few steps behind. Inside, the air was cooler but thick with tobacco smoke. A clerk sat at a scarred wooden desk, barely looking up as they entered. His fingers were stained with ink, his expression one of practiced boredom. "Yes?" he drawled, not pausing in his writing. Eliza stepped forward, squaring her shoulders. "Sir, I've come about a land deed. It's properly signed, with treaty rights." "What kind of deed?" The clerk's tone sharpened. "It's—" Eliza swallowed hard. "It's an Apache allotment, sir. But legal, with government signatures. Oh, Indian paperwork." He waved his hand dismissively. "Those old things ain't worth the paper they're written on, ma'am. But, sir, please look." Eliza unfolded the deed with careful fingers. "These signatures—" A young officer nearby shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Eliza and the clerk. He stepped closer, peering at the document, but an older officer swept in before he could speak. "Problem here, Jenkins?" The superior's voice cracked like a whip. "No, sir. Just some outdated Indian business." The clerk's chair creaked as he leaned back. "Nothing to trouble yourself with." The older officer barely glanced at Eliza or the deed in her trembling hands. "Then clear them out. We've got real work to do." Heat rushed to Eliza's face. She felt Tommy's small hand slip into hers, felt Taza's solid presence behind her. But none of it could shield her from the shame burning in her chest. Outside, the afternoon sun seemed to mock their failure. Eliza stood in its glare, clutching the useless deed, fighting back tears. When they reached their wagon, she couldn't hold them back any longer. "Lord," she prayed aloud, voice breaking, "how can there be such injustice? How can your truth be ignored so easily?" The words poured out of her, raw and honest, as she lifted her face to the sky. Taza, who rarely spoke of such matters, surprised her by responding. "White paper means little unless hearts change," he said quietly. "That is the greater battle." His dark eyes held ancient wisdom and fresh pain. Papers burn, fade, get lost. But when hearts learn truth, that cannot be undone. They made camp several miles from the fort in a hollow sheltered by cottonwoods. The evening air smelled of sage and wood smoke as their cooking fire crackled. A pot of beans bubbling above the flames. Tommy sat cross-legged near the fire, unusually quiet as he watched Eliza stir the beans. Finally, in a small voice, he asked the question weighing on all their minds. "Does this mean we lost?" Eliza set down the wooden spoon and opened her arms. The boy crawled into them immediately, pressing his face against her shoulder. She held him close, breathing in the dust and sunshine smell of his hair. "Not yet," she said softly, but firmly. "Not as long as we keep trying. Not as long as we believe in what's right." They slept under the stars that night, each lost in their own thoughts. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another long day of travel. As they hitched up the mule and prepared to head home, Eliza felt bone-weary but oddly peaceful. The deed might have been rejected, but it hadn't destroyed her resolve. Something in Taza's words about changing hearts had taken root in her soul. She didn't understand yet how to fight such a battle, but she knew she would find a way. After 4 grueling days on the trail, the wagon creaked over the final ridge toward home. Eliza's heart sank at the sight below. A cluster of horses and riders waited near her small hut, their figures dark against the afternoon sun. Tommy pressed closer to her side on the wagon seat. "Trouble," Taza murmured, hand moving to his knife belt. As they drew nearer, Eliza recognized Mr. Kettle's sleek bay horse. The railroad lawyer sat straight-backed in his polished saddle, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Several townspeople flanked him, the mercantile owner, 2 ranch hands, and the sheriff looking uncomfortable at the edge of the group. Reverend Caraway stood apart from the others, his worn Bible clutched in weathered hands. His presence gave Eliza a small measure of comfort as she pulled the mule to a stop. "Mrs. Cartwright." Kettle's voice dripped false courtesy. "How fortunate you've returned. We've been waiting to discuss an urgent matter of property rights." Eliza climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from travel. Dust coated her skirts and boots. She lifted her chin, refusing to show weakness before these men who had likely set fire to her crops. "This is my land, Mr. Kettle. I hold a legal deed." "Ah, yes, that quaint Indian document." He pulled papers from his portfolio with a flourish. "I'm afraid it's quite superseded by these railway claims. Properly filed with the territorial office, I might add." Reverend Caraway stepped forward, his usually gentle voice sharp with anger. "Those claims are fraudulent, sir, and you know it. This valley was legally allocated under treaty provisions." "Treaties change, Reverend." Kettle smiled and reached his eyes. "Progress cannot be stopped by outdated scraps of paper. The railroad requires this route for its new spur line. How much time?" Eliza's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Given your ... double quotes." Kettle paused delicately. "Unfortunate circumstances will allow 1 week to vacate the premises. After that, we'll be forced to pursue legal action." "1 week?" Eliza's hands clenched into fists. "My crops are just recovering from the fire your men set. I need more time." "I'm sure I don't know what fire you mean." Kettle adjusted his coat sleeve. 1 week, Mrs. Cartwright. I suggest you use it wisely. He wheeled his horse around, the other riders following. Only the sheriff lingered. Touching his hat brim apologetically before turning away, Reverend Caraway gripped Eliza's shoulder. This isn't right. We'll fight it, child. How? The word came out as a whisper. I've no money for lawyers. The fort wouldn't help. The Lord provides paths we cannot see. The preacher squeezed her shoulder once more before mounting his own horse. Keep faith. I'll speak to some people in town. Eliza watched them all ride away, leaving only clouds of dust and the weight of despair. Tommy hugged her waist while Taza began unhitching the tired mule. The sun set in streaks of orange and purple. After a simple supper of cornbread and beans, Tommy fell asleep wrapped in his blanket. Eliza walked to the creek alone, her heart too heavy for rest. The water whispered over stones in the darkness. Stars pricked the velvet sky, countless as her worries. Eliza sank to her knees in the cool grass, clasping her hands. Lord, she whispered, I don't understand your purpose here. I've tried to work this land with honor, to make something good grow. Please show me the way forward. Quiet footsteps approached Taza, moving like a shadow in the night. He stood silent for a moment before placing a warm hand on her shoulder. Seeds grow even after fire, he said softly. Remember that. Eliza covered his hand with her own, drawing strength from the simple touch. They stayed that way for several breaths before he moved away. Later, as she prepared for bed, she noticed Taza digging near the corner of her hut. By lantern light, he carefully buried a small clay jar, smoothing dirt over the spot. What's that? For? She asked. He straightened, brushing earth from his hands. When time is right, you will know. Without further explanation, he melted into the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. The next days passed in a blur of anxious activity. Eliza threw herself into working the land, as if sheer effort could somehow save it. She and Tommy hauled water from the creek, tending the surviving corn stalks. Their green leaves reached skyward, defiant of fire and threat alike. Each morning, she checked the plants for new growth, counting every fresh leaf like precious coins. Tommy helped mend the rough fence around the plot, his small hands quick with twine and wood. They cooked simple meals over the fire, saving every scrap, uncertain of their future provisions. Through it all, the weight of Kettle's deadline pressed down like an invisible hand. Eliza found herself watching the road, starting at every distant hoof beat. Her prayers grew more desperate as the days slipped past. At night, she often lay awake, listening to Tommy's soft breathing and the coyotes' distant songs. Her faith, once a solid foundation, felt stretched tissue thin. Yet something kept her from packing their meager belongings. Perhaps the memory of those first green shoots pushing through soil, or Taza's quiet words about seeds and survival. Mysterious clay jar remained buried by her hut, its purpose unknown but somehow comforting. Like a secret promise waiting to be revealed, it reminded her that hope could lie hidden beneath the surface of things. The morning of the deadline dawned cold and gray. Eliza stood in her doorway, watching the sun climb above distant peaks. She had barely slept, spending most of the night in prayer. Tommy sat cross-legged by the dying cook fire, pushing beans around his tin plate. The sound came first, hoof beats and wagon wheels grinding over rocky ground. Eliza's hands trembled as she smoothed her faded dress. She wouldn't give Kettle the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. Tommy, she called softly. Go inside now. The boy scurried into the hut as riders appeared over the rise. Mr. Kettle led them, looking pleased with himself atop his bay horse. Behind him came 2 deputies, their badges glinting dully in the morning light. A wagon followed, loaded with several ranch hands. Your week is up, Mrs. Cartwright. Kettle's voice carried across the yard. I trust you're packed and ready to vacate the premises? Eliza lifted her chin. I am not leaving my land, Mr. Kettle. This ceased being your land the moment the railroad claimed it. He dismounted, boots raising dust. Deputies, please escort Mrs. Cartwright and the boy off the property. Before the deputies could move, new voices rang out. Reverend Caraway appeared on the trail, leading several townspeople, the blacksmith, 2 farming families, even the widow who ran the boarding house. They formed a line between Eliza's hut and Kettle's men. This is not right, the preacher declared, his Bible clutched firmly. You cannot drive a widow from her rightful property. Kettle's face reddened. This is none of your concern, Reverend. The law? The law? The law? A deep voice cut through the morning air. Taza emerged from the cottonwoods, tall and dignified. Behind him came 3 Apache elders, their faces weathered as the surrounding hills. Each carried rolled papers bound with leather thongs. These are the true laws, Taza said, as one elder carefully unrolled a document. Treaty papers. Signed by your government's own hands. This valley was given in trust, never to be taken. The deputies shifted uneasily in their saddles. One whispered to the other, clearly reluctant to take action against such a gathering. Kettle's voice rose sharply. Those treaties are worthless. Progress cannot be stopped by ancient promises to what, Mr. Kettle? Reverend Caraway stepped forward. To God's children? To those who work the land with honest hands? He raised his Bible high. This valley belongs not to greed, but to justice and the Lord's providence. The morning air crackled with tension. Tommy peered from the doorway. While Eliza's heart pounded, the deputies exchanged glances, then one slowly shook his head at Kettle. Sir, he said quietly, we can't forcibly remove all these folks, not without proper papers from the territorial judge. Kettle's face twisted with rage. Then tear down this hovel. Clear the land for the survey crew. The ranch hands in the wagon stayed seated, looking anywhere but at their employer. The second deputy touched his hat brim apologetically. No, sir, he said. That wouldn't be legal neither, not with disputed ownership. Cowards, Kettle spun to face Eliza. This isn't over. Woman, I'll bring the federal marshal next time. The territorial governor himself if I must. This land will serve progress, not be wasted on your pathetic corn patch. He yanked his horse's head around, spurring it perhaps harder than necessary. The deputies followed at a more dignified pace, the wagon creaking behind them. Eliza's legs felt weak with relief. The townsfolk gathered around her, offering quiet words of support. The Apache elders spoke briefly with Taza before departing, leaving their treaty copies in his care. The Lord keeps his promises, Reverend Caraway said, squeezing her shoulder. Remember that in the days ahead. As the supporters gradually dispersed, Eliza sank onto the rough bench by her door. Tommy brought her a cup of water, his small face serious. Are we really staying? He asked. Yes, she said, drawing him close. This is our home. The rest of the day passed in a blur of normal tasks, watering the surviving corn, feeding the mule, preparing their evening meal. But everything felt different now, as if the very air had changed. That evening, Eliza lit the lamp while Tommy arranged their bedrolls. The familiar words of her mother's Bible brought comfort as she opened to the 23rd Psalm. Her voice grew stronger with each verse. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Tommy listened intently, his eyes heavy with sleep. Outside their window, the moon rose over the valley, its light catching the silk of the corn leaves. The surviving stalks stood tall against the night sky, their gentle rustling, a reminder of life's persistence. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Eliza closed the Bible softly, watching Tommy drift into peaceful sleep. Though Kettle would return with greater force tonight, she felt the strength of community and faith flowing through her veins like a river. Whatever came next, she would face it standing firm on this land that Providence had given into her care. 3 days after the standoff, Eliza worked her garden. In the cool morning air, Tommy hauled water from the creek, whistling as he walked. The routine felt peaceful, almost normal, though she knew Kettle's threats still hung over them like storm clouds. The sound of horses approaching made her straighten, shading her eyes against the rising sun. Her heart jumped when she recognized the Army uniforms. Leading the small group was the young officer from Fort Garland, Lieutenant Harrison. She remembered, but his bearing seemed different now. Gone was the dismissive attitude she'd encountered at the fort. Mrs. Cartwright, he called out, dismounting. His face was drawn with something that looked like shame. I need to speak with you, and ... He hesitated. I believe the town should hear what I have to say. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, studying him carefully. Tommy, she said, Ride into town and ask Reverend Caraway to gather folks at the church." The boys scrambled onto their mule, eager for the important task. Lieutenant Harrison waited quietly while Eliza changed her soiled work dress for her one good outfit. Taza appeared as if from nowhere, as he often did, watching the proceedings with careful eyes. An hour later, the churchyard filled with townspeople, drawn by word of the army's presence. Mr. Kettle pushed through the crowd, his usual smirk faltering at the sight of the lieutenant's grave face. Reverend Caraway stood on the church steps, providing an air of authority to the impromptu gathering. Lieutenant Harrison removed his hat, running fingers through his hair before addressing the crowd. "Good people of the valley," he began, his voice carrying across the yard, "I come to right a wrong, one that has weighed heavily on my conscience these past weeks." The murmuring crowd grew still. Eliza felt her heart beating fast beneath her collar. When Mrs. Cartwright presented her deed at Fort Garland, I knew in that moment it was genuine. He paused, swallowing hard. "But I had orders. Orders to dismiss any claims that might interfere with the railroad's plans for this territory." A gasp rippled through the gathered townspeople. Kettle's face grew red as he stepped forward. "Now see here, Lieutenant." "No, sir, you will hear this." Harrison's voice grew stronger. "I have here." He held up a leather folder, copies of the original treaty documents. Mrs. Cartwright's deed is legitimate, signed by both Army and tribal authorities. The land was legally transferred, and her claim is valid under both territorial and federal law. The crowd erupted in whispers. Eliza felt tears pricking at her eyes as Harrison continued. "My superiors," he took a deep breath, "my superiors ordered us to ignore such claims, to favor the railroad's interests over justice. But I can no longer be party to this deception." He turned to face Eliza directly. "Mrs. Cartwright, I formally acknowledge your right to this land. The United States Army will honor the original treaty and your deed of ownership. This is outrageous." Kettle pushed forward, his face mottled with rage. "I'll have lawyers from Denver. Your lawyers will find everything in order, Mr. Kettle." Harrison's voice turned cold. "Unless you wish them to examine too closely how you acquired other land claims in this territory." Kettle's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he turned and stormed away, shouldering roughly through the crowd. Several people who had previously supported him now turned their backs as he passed. Reverend Caraway stepped forward, laying a hand on Eliza's shoulder. "The Lord's truth will out," he said softly, "always." Taza, who had stood silent through the entire speech, finally spoke. "Truth endures," he said simply, but his dark eyes held satisfaction. The gathering gradually dispersed, many stopping to congratulate Eliza or offer belated welcome to the community. Tommy hugged her waist, grinning up at her tear-streaked face. "Does this mean we can plant more corn?" he asked. "Yes," she laughed, ruffling his hair. "Much more corn." That evening, Eliza sat by her cook fire, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold. The land felt different now, as if its very soil had settled more firmly beneath her feet. The tension she'd carried for so long began to ease from her shoulders. Taza sat across the fire, carefully stirring a pot of beans. Tommy lay nearby, humming a hymn tune as he whittled a stick. The peaceful scene brought fresh tears to Eliza's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Taza. "Without your help," he shook his head, interrupting her gently. "It was always the land's gift," he said. "You only guarded it, as others guarded it before, and others will guard it after." He gestured to the valley around them. "The land knows its people." The fire crackled softly as darkness settled over the valley. Stars emerged one by one, bright and clear in the mountain air. Tommy's humming blended with the night sound's crickets, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of corn leaves in the evening breeze. Eliza felt peace settle over her like a familiar blanket. This valley was her home now, truly and legally hers. A place where she could build a future, where Tommy could grow up strong and free, where two cultures could meet in understanding rather than conflict. She looked across the fire at Taza, seeing in his quiet smile the same sense of rightness, of justice restored. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fields to tend, fences to mend, a life to build. But tonight, they sat together in the valley that had called them all home, beneath stars that had witnessed countless stories of loss and hope, defeat and redemption. Tommy's humming grew softer as he drifted toward sleep, the half-whittled stick falling from his fingers. The fire burned low, casting warm light on their small circle of peace. The first frost came early that year, coating the valley in delicate white crystals that sparkled in the dawn light. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter as she walked through her corn patch, checking which stalks had survived the railroad's fire. Though many blackened rows remained as stark reminders, enough plants had lived to give her hope. Tommy darted between the rows, his breath making little clouds in the cold morning air. "Ma'am, these ones are ready," he called out, pointing to a stretch of golden ears hanging heavy on their stalks. "Careful now," she cautioned, showing him how to twist and pull the corn properly. They worked steadily through the morning, their basket filling with ears of different sizes. Some were small and twisted from the harsh summer, but others had grown full and proud despite everything. By midday, Eliza's back ached from bending, but satisfaction warmed her more than the autumn sun. She had survived. More than survived, she had grown food from nearly nothing. The thought brought tears to her eyes as she remembered those desperate days begging outside the general store. How far she had come since Taza first placed that leather pouch in her hands. "Riders coming," Tommy announced, shading his eyes. Eliza straightened, her heart still jumping at unexpected visitors. But instead of railroad men, she saw familiar faces from town. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife who had once crossed the street to avoid her, led the group. Behind her rode 3 other women, all carrying baskets. "Thought you might need help with the harvest," Sarah called out, dismounting. She looked almost shy now, different from her previous scorn. "And I brought a pie-apple and cinnamon." Eliza swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "Much obliged," she managed. The women set to work, their skirts swishing through the corn rows as they gathered ears into their aprons. Their chatter filled the crisp air, punctuated by Tommy's excited updates on their progress. By late afternoon, they had harvested most of the surviving corn. Reverend Caraway's organizing a proper gathering, Sarah mentioned as they sorted the ears for drying. "Says it's time the town showed its support, seeing as how you've proved yourself and all." She paused, looking embarrassed. "We weren't kind before. Some of us are trying to make that right." Over the next few days, more townspeople arrived. Boys from the orphanage trudged up the trail, arms loaded with firewood. Ranch hands helped repair her fences, while their wives brought preserves and dried meat. Even the sheriff stopped by, offering to help dig a root cellar for her winter stores. Eliza shared what she could: fresh cornbread,
roasted ears, and the sweet satisfaction of eating food grown from her own soil.
The preacher came to bless her expanded garden plot where she had planted potatoes late in the season. They might not yield much, but it was a start for next year. Her little hut gradually transformed as well. With help from neighbors, she added a proper room, a porch, and a stone chimney. The cabin wasn't grand, but it was sturdy against the mountain winds. Tommy helped her chink between the logs with mud and grass, his small hands working alongside hers. "Reckon this'll keep us warm enough?" he asked one evening, stepping back to admire their work. The casual us made her heart swell. "I reckon so," she replied, ruffling his hair. He ducked away with a grin, but she noticed how he stayed close. Like a sapling growing strong beside an established tree, the Apache women returned as autumn deepened, bringing baskets woven tight enough to store grain. They showed Eliza their way of drying corn, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. Though they spoke little English, their gestures and patient demonstrations built bridges stronger than words. One of them, an elder with silver hair and kind eyes, presented Eliza with a basket of dried berries and pine nuts. "For winter," she said simply. "When snow comes." The gift carried more than just food. It offered acceptance, acknowledgement that Eliza had earned her place on this land. Taza visited more frequently now, helping her prepare for the harsh months ahead. He showed her how to smoke meat, where to find the best firewood, which plants could still be gathered before winter set in. Their friendship had deepened into something neither of them named but both treasured, a bond built on respect, trust, and shared love for the valley. One evening, as geese arrowed south against the sunset, they sat together on her new porch. Tommy had fallen asleep inside, worn out from a day of stacking wood. The air held that peculiar autumn stillness, like the world drawing in one last breath before winter. I never thought I'd have this, Eliza said softly, gesturing at her cabin. The harvested field, the smoke rising straight from her chimney. When you gave me those seeds, I was so close to giving up. Taza nodded, his profile strong against the darkening sky. The seeds knew, he said. They grew more than corn. They grew hope, she agreed, and not just for me. This valley ... It's bringing people together who never would have shared a meal before. She turned to face him fully. Thank you. For trusting me with your land, with your knowledge. For seeing something in me when everyone else looked away. Life feeds life. Taza replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of his people. The corn grows tall, it feeds the people. The people grow strong, they tend the land. All things connect. He gestured to where Tommy's small shoes sat by the door. New roots grow. New stories begin. They sat in companionable silence as stars began to pepper the darkening sky. The first coyotes called in the distance, their songs echoing off the valley walls. Below them, Eliza's storage bins held enough corn to see them through winter, enough to share with neighbors, enough to plant come spring. She thought of those first desperate days, kneeling in the mud outside the general store. How far she had come, how much had grown from a simple handful of seeds. The harvest had yielded more than food, it had grown community, acceptance, and the deep satisfaction of working land that knew her name. From inside came Tommy's soft snores, peaceful and trusting. On her porch sat a man whose quiet wisdom had changed her life. And all around her stretched the valley that had become more than shelter, it had become home. The first snowflakes of winter drifted past Eliza's window like tiny white feathers. Inside her snug cabin, warmth and savory aromas filled the air. The stone fireplace crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows on the log walls she and Tommy had chinked together. Around her sturdy table sat an unlikely family. Reverend Caraway blessed the steaming dishes of cornbread, bean soup, and rich venison stew. Tommy proudly helped serve 2 young orphan boys who now had a place to call home. Several widows who had once shunned her now shared her hearth, their faces bright with conversation. Taza sat with his kin, his quiet dignity a reminder of how far they'd all come. Laughter rippled through the room as bread was passed and bowls were filled. Eliza paused, overcome by the simple miracle before her. Just months ago, I stood begging for crusts outside the general store, she said softly. Then a giant Apache left me with something greater than food. He gave me seeds of hope. Taza nodded, understanding in his eyes. They broke bread together, this gathering of souls brought together by hardship and healing. Outside, snow continued to fall, blessing the valley that now belonged not to greed, but to faith, courage, and the bonds of true community. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.